Hello and welcome to this Getting Pro Records from Home mini-series. This video is building pop-punk guitar tones with amp sims. I want to share with you my framework for getting tones like this with just a guitar straight into your interface. So that guitar tone was made from a guitar DI that was recorded directly into my interface. In fact, that whole song was recorded and mixed from home. So I want to show you how I got that guitar tone and my framework for getting great guitar tones from just a standard guitar DI from a home interface. And just quickly, I want to mention that if you make this kind of music and you want me to mix your next single or album, then head over to terrybeckleyrecording.com and hit me up via the contact form. I will get back to you. The link is in the description. Okay, so let's get into the guitar tone itself. So if you've seen my other guitar mixing videos, you'll know that my go-to amp sim is the Archetype Nolly from Neural DSP, with the exception of Tone Hub and a couple from Joey Sturgis tones. I just don't think anything comes close to this. So this is the 5150 emulation with the matching cab. So let's go through. I haven't engaged the tube screamer here, but I did want to point out that usually I would use the tube screamer, and I will get to that later on in the video, to clean up sort of low-end mud, but in this one I sort of wanted that body there, and I felt like this was sucking it out too much. So this is one of the rare occasions that I don't have a tube screamer before the guitar, before the amp head. Okay, so I always try and get as little amount of gain as possible with it still sounding good. Usually that is when you load the plugin up, as long as you've got your gain staging right. So over here, your guitar DI is just touching the orange on the meters. Usually right down the middle, Neural DSP, good level of gain. I whack my low up all the way because that's basically just a low pass filter on guitar amps, and you can deal with that later on with an EQ in the mixing stage. I like to boost the presence, boost the high a little bit, but not too much. Any actual presence I want from the tone in the context of the mix, I will use an EQ afterwards. And then mids, yes, with real amps, you would want to scoop the mid. I feel like with amp sims, if you scoop the mid, it does sound great in solo, but in the context of the mix, you lose the guitars. I feel like you've got bass down there at the low end competing, you've got cymbals and vocals in the high end. The mids is really where the guitars take ownership. Don't lose your mids. There is always a honkiness to guitars that mids boosts give, and that will be dealt with later on with an EQ. But in terms of the rough tone, before you start shaping it with mixing tools, keep the mids in there, is my advice. And let's look at the cab. So I do usually have a 57 and I use a ribbon mic, so the 160 on this plugin. But as you can see here, I do actually have the 160 on a different track because I like to play with the level of it at different parts of the song. So I've got the 57 just outside the inner cone here, just on that little ridge, on that rim. Usually is the best place to put it, and that is actually where I would start with a real amp in real life. So that's how realistic this plugin is, and I love it for that. So that was like sort of the heavier end of the pop-punk emo spectrum, almost getting into the metalcore sort of sound. So let's do one that is a bit more pop-punk and a bit less gritty. Okay, so let's take the chorus of this song and start from scratch. Let's hear the DI. Cool, that's it, just a DI, no fancy equipment. Like I said before, pro records from home. Sometimes if the guitar player hasn't been particularly heavy with their right hand, you're not getting enough pick attack or it's a bit inconsistent, the DI is the time to either put a compressor on there or a transient designer to emphasize the attack. In this case, it's fine, there's enough pick attack in there. But what I would do, if it wasn't, I would stick on something like this, the 1176. I would make the attack slow, I'd make the release fast. I wouldn't do too much, and I would make it a bit more, give it a bit more attack. You don't need to in this case, but that's something worth a try. Or if you really wanted to, you could use something like this. This is the transient designer from Plugin Alliance, and you could boost the attack here. But like I said, don't need to on this one. Okay, so we are working with amp sims. So let's pretend it was a real amp and we were running it into a preamp in a studio. So before anything, you would have the amp itself. So neural DSP, archetype nollie, stereo, because I've actually got a stereo track of 2 different guitar takes there. So I like to run it in stereo because it gives me the best idea of how the guitar tone is going to sound when the doubles are stacked up left and right in the stereo field. So we've already used this amp. Let's use this one with the same cab. I already know off the bat I'm going to do this and flick the brightness on. Okay, let's hear what we have with no settings touched. That's a crunch amp, right? First thing I'm seeing is that we're not quite hitting the right gain staging part. I want to be hitting where the meters turn from green to yellow. So let's adjust that first of all. So what's so good about these neural DSP amp sims is that you can push the input in until it starts to get a bit distorted. Push it to where it sounds nice before you touch any controls. So I've pushed the input there at 6. I like how it's starting to distort, so we'll go from there. Next thing I would do is get the amount of gain I want. Just play around with that till we get something that's a bit more distorted, a bit more punky. So I will always try to get away with the least amount of gain as possible. I saw when I pulled it back before the 6, it was going crunchy again. Past the 6, it was actually getting distorted. So I'll go with as little as I can. I actually didn't think there was much difference between that sort of in between 6 and 7 area and all the way around to the 10. Okay, and if, like I said before, bass, whack that up. Now let's go for how much presence we want out of the amp. So we're looking for presence, bite, and pick attack with this. I like that. It's a little fizzy, but like we saw with the EQ, that's fine. We can deal with that. In fact, when the presence is off, it's even fizzier. So the presence is sort of counteracting the fizziness from the treble boost, which is why I've got it there set to 7. Now, things like depth are specific to this amp sim. They sort of give it that sort of like amp in a room, low end sort of build up. I don't usually touch that. I like where it is set at 5. And master isn't actually the overall volume, that's level. So it'd be level that you would want to get the volume out of the amp with. Cool, now we're going to play around with the mid to try and get it to sound like it has that mid-range presence that we want from guitars in a mix. Now there is a perfect example of the trap I was talking about. You scoop the mid, you turn it off, it sounds way better. But in a mix, I promise you, it is not going to sound good. You suck the mids out completely, you get a much nicer sounding guitar tone. But you are going to lose the guitars when all the bass, cymbals and vocals are in there, because mid-range is where the guitars really shine through. It's the only place they're not really competing with anything else that you want. So here, we'll set it at 6, and then we can notch out the honkiness from it with an EQ later. So like I said before about the pedal, let's turn on this Tube Screamer emulation, and get it to sort of control those sort of low mids that are making it a little bit flabby. So drive off, a little bit extra brightness out of the tone. Let's see what that sounds like. I love how that cleans them up so nicely. You see, when that's off, it's a little bit flabby down there and it sort of loses its focus. You turn that on and it just cleans them up. They just sound cleaner. Let me play that again so you can listen for it. We'll start with it off. Yeah, I love that. You do lose a little bit of the pick attack, but this is around the time that you could decide then to go back and use the compressor like I showed, or the transient designer to get a bit more of that pick attack back, or even use the compressor here inside the plugin. Hear how that brings the pick attack back when it's set to snappy there. That's to get that attack out of it. But I actually didn't mind that, so we'll keep that in. We'll just dial it back a little bit. Okay, the mics. So we'll move the 57 around to get a nice sweet spot. It's probably already in the sweet spot with these plugins. When you load them up, they usually sound as pretty great straight away. And then we will add in the ribbon mic that I like to do to sort of give it a bit more of that beef. Okay. Yeah, so it's pretty much there already. You'll usually find, if you can see here, you've got the big outer cone and then you've got the little inner one here. It's usually on the boundary of that here. As close up to the amp, which is what this position control is here. You can see it comes away in towards the amp. Straight as close to the amp as you can get, and then on that little ridge there, which is very much true to life. With a real cabinet, I think that's usually where I would start with the mic. Okay, let's get the 160 involved in. And then we only want a bit of this, but it's nice to get that sort of lower beefiness. Cool, so that it actually makes it a lot more smoother. You do lose a bit of the bite. So you can see why I like to put them on separate tracks, because I actually like to have the 57 as the main sound and then just sort of bring the 160 in. I feel like through the plugin it's a lot harder to control and you lose a lot more of that presence and bite that you get from the 57. It becomes smoother and nicer sounding, but that's not really what we want, is it, in pop punk and similar sort of genres. But yeah, I'd be pretty happy with that as a starting point and then go in and sort of refine it with EQ and whatever from there. Okay, so once those tones are printed down, I had them in the mix here. On the 57, I literally just have the Shep 73 from Waves, which is just a preamp emulation of the Neve 1073. Not doing anything, just running it through because I just like the subtle harmonic saturation that it gives us. The 160, on the other hand, because that's a bit more mid-rangey and can get a bit muddy, has the same Shep 73 on it. Nothing happening. Then a C4 multi-band compressor. I'm sure many of you have seen this Andy Sneap trick here where you sort of set it to where the palm mute muddiness is happening, so that when the palm mutes hit, it just ducks them down slightly so that it doesn't muddy up your whole guitar tone and mix. If I play this, you'll see it only really working when the palm mutes are hitting. So let's have a listen. There's a bit of delay compensation happening, so the compressor looks like it's happening a little later than the palm mutes, but you can see only at certain points does that little orange line dip down. Let's have a look again so you can see what I mean. It's only triggered from that sort of muddiness boost that the palm mutes give. Next up, if you've seen any of my other guitar mixing videos, I always try and phase align them to see if it makes it better. When you're layering up multi-tracked guitars, so the same DI but different tones, you can have phase cancellation issues. That's why I've shifted one of them back 1.47 milliseconds and then flipped the phase, because I thought that it sounded fuller. And then lastly on there, you've got a Pro Q3. This will be where the actual proper low end note of the guitar is, and then a scoop here. This scoops the muddiness out, which allows me to boost that sort of low end note just a little bit to get a bit more body from the guitar. I want to solo those bits in Pro Q3 so you can hear what I'm boosting and what I'm cutting. So just the 160 by itself, let's have a listen. That sounds really rumbly by itself, but it's where that sort of low note-ness comes from. And then this cut. So that's sort of the whooshy part of that you don't want. So you get rid of that so that you can boost this a little bit and as much as you can get away with. So both of those run to a rhythm guitar bus, which is where the bulk of the mixing actually happens. So first off, EQ, rolling off the low end, making room for the bass kick drum. Rolling off the fizzy high end, that is something as well that you get with amp sims. You get an extra fizzy high end. So it's important to cut back on what you can so you don't lose any of its bite and presence, but just the hiss. In fact, let me show you what that sounds like if I turn that off and on, and it should just be an excess of hiss when that EQ is disengaged. So that's strikingly obvious, right? It's just fizz. And when you get rid of it, the guitars are still really present, really bitey. Just get rid of that hiss from up there. So these are two nasty frequencies, resonant frequencies. You always around this point in guitars, 2 to 3 kilohertz, and then around 4K. There's always going to be something that's nasty there. I always like to do this little mid cut here. As you saw from before, I boost the mids in the amp sim. That'll always give you a little bit of honkiness. So if you can pinpoint that little honkiness and just dip it out, it's actually quite a big one here, look, nearly 6.5 decibels. Gets rid of the honk and sort of brings the guitars into focus. Let me play you that off and on. It is quite subtle, but it does sort of stops the guitars from being washy. Is the best way I can describe it. Let me play it. See, it's like a honky noise. It's the best way I can sort of describe it, like a honk. You just have to find that and just sort of notch it out, and you'll get much nicer sounding mid-range on the guitars. I'm sure we've all been there mixing guitars where we've scooped the mid-range and it makes them sound so much beefier and so much more present and nicer, but in the whole mix, you actually end up losing the guitars if you lose the mid-range. So just get rid of that honky bit of the mid-range that's not nice, and you get better sounding guitars. A slight dip here of mud, 200 hertz. And then another boost here where the sort of low end note is to get that beefiness out. Why don't we hear the whole thing with the EQ off and on, the whole EQ settings, so you'll see just how important this EQ is. You are trimming them down effectively to fit them into a mix. Obviously they're bigger, louder and fizzier, beefier without the EQ moves, but you want to trim down the excess bit so you get the best bit of the guitars in the mix and you don't fight cymbals, vocals, bass, and you get a nice clean mid-range. Okay, I love this EQ. I put it on, I try it. If it doesn't work, I take it off. But in this case, I've got a little boost here where it's like a shelf at 2.5 kilohertz there, literally as small as I can make it, just for a bit of extra presence on the guitars. Okay, so you've seen the tone that went into that song. You've seen me do a tone from scratch. So let's get into the specifics of my framework of how to get good sounding guitars with amp sims and DIs alone. And that all comes down to the standards you had when you recorded your guitar DI track. So these guitars were recorded straight into an Audient ID4 interface. Nothing special. Any interface will be fine. But if I zoom out here, you'll see how I've done it strategically. All of these regions are different takes, and I've recorded it bit by bit. I haven't tried to do the whole song in one go, so there's no extra sort of buzzing or noise. I've made sure that each take was really clean, really in tune. I cannot stress how important it is to have them in tune. No extra open strings getting hit from any rhythm parts, and every rhythm part double tracked so that you can have a fully panned left and fully panned right guitar. That gives you wideness. That is, although it's a step that I think most people obviously do anyway, but I think just to make sure it doesn't get missed, that is so important. Double track everything, keep it dead in time. Make sure the double tracks are completely locked in with each other. So let me play you this DI soloed so you can hear how clean it sounds. See, that's a double track. It's very in time. There's no extra ringing or there's no extra open strings or anything like that happening. It's only the notes I want in the recording. And there's good pick attack. You can see from the DI how strong the pick attack is, and that's important too. And they are super in tune. That is so important. Make sure that every couple of takes you're retuning it and making sure it's dead in tune. So there we have double track guitars. As you can see here, hard pan left and right. So rather than trying to get a guitar tone from just one mono guitar track, what I'll do is I'll join the two tracks to create a stereo track like this. In Logic, you can just join. And then here, I will load up a stereo instance of Archetype Nolly. And straight off the bat, flicking it to stereo, with the default settings, it should sound pretty good. And it does. That's why Archetype Nolly is my go-to plugin, because it just sounds great. If a good clean DI that's hitting the yellow on the meter's gain staging wise, so down here, it should sound good as soon as you open the plugin. So as you saw earlier with EQ, we do sculpt the sound a bit further, but what else I will do to get a sort of more real sounding guitar tone, as if it was a real amp, is I will use something like the Shep 73 from Waves, the Neve 1073 emulation. I won't touch it, I'll just run it through the plugin because it gives a sort of very subtle harmonic saturation, which makes it sound real and gives it a sort of ambiguous analog sound. Let me play you the plugin on and off so you can see what I mean. It does something. See, just running it through the plugin does something, and it makes it sound a bit more analog and a bit more real. So beyond that, some extra saturation, some post-saturation. I like to use the Saturn II, and I like to use the clean tube setting. This can get a bit fizzy, so you've got to be careful, but it just adds a bit of life to it, as I'll demonstrate here. Just adds life. Again, saturation is great. Use it sparingly. And then like we saw earlier with the EQ, when you pull the top end out and you use those filters, you can get rid of that sort of fizz and keep the presence and the energy there. So usually the next step then would be to EQ it. I would always use a low pass and a high pass filter. So let's get that sort of whooshy low end out of the way first. Now let's get the high end under control. Okay, perfect. Now let's remove some honk. And then some of those harsh frequencies in the 2 to 4 kilohertz region. And there you have it. That is my framework for a good starting point of a guitar tone. From there on, you can mold it however you need to fit it into the mix. I mean, I didn't even touch the settings. Usually, like you saw earlier in the video, I would tinker to get those sounding a certain way. But I just wanted to show you a quick framework of how you can do these same steps every time to get a really good guitar tone just using amp sims. So a good amp sim, preamp emulation, post harmonic saturation, and tidying it a little bit up with EQ. Then you have good, real sounding, lively, energetic, good guitars. So hopefully you got some value from that and you can apply these same things to your recordings at home. This video is going to be part of a bigger series on getting pro records from home. And my aim is that this can help artists, bands and artists like yourselves to get really good quality sounding stuff from your home studios, and therefore you can spend less money and less time recording in a real studio because you don't need to, and then you can release and write more music, because that's what it's all about: consistency, releasing more music and getting on the good side of those algorithms. So again, if you make music like this and you'd like me to mix your next single or album, then head over to terrybeckleyrecording.com, get in contact with me via the contact form there, and I will definitely get back to you. The link is in the description. Subscribe if you want to see the future videos of this series of getting pro records from home. I will release them as regularly as I can. And thank you very much for watching. I will see you at the next one.